we're going to see a change come over ancient Greek culture. Gone is the focus on the ideal, the perfect, and the kind of confident optimism in human reason, in the art, in the literature, in the philosophy. You see intense suffering and pain. And we'll talk more about that in another video as we deal with Medea. And again, when we talk about philosophy, and you'll see it in the art as well. But I want to talk about what's behind that. And the answer is a date I need you to remember for your middle of semester opportunity to excel. 431 to 404 BC, the Peloponnesian War. A war fought between Athens and Sparta. And if you do the math, a war that lasted 27 years. That's probably longer than most of you have been breathing. It's not as long as I've been teaching at Grambling State, so what does that say about me? And in that war, not only do you get the direct casualties of war, the soldiers who get killed, but you get a lot of other causes of suffering as well. Often their war is accompanied by pandemics because people are moving, and that spreads disease. We're in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic now. The last major pandemic in the United States, and in fact globally, was in 1918, the so-called Spanish flu. Well, what was going on in 1918? World War I. You had people from all over the world in Europe fighting. The Americans went over, including, by the way, one of my grandfathers. The French and British brought in colonial troops from throughout their empires. And, when it's like COVID, when you get people from different places mingling, one of the things that gets transmitted is germs. And so there was a major plague in Athens during the Peloponnesian War. With all of the men away fighting, there's less food because those men are not at home growing crops. And so prices go up, taxes go up to pay for the war. At the same time, people's income is down. And so there was famine and hunger. And in wartime, people often get callous to human suffering, and particularly suffering of their opponents. So there are always atrocities committed, generally on both sides. And that certainly happened in the Peloponnesian War. Now, if you look back at one of the readings we looked at earlier, Thucydides' funeral speech from History of the Peloponnesian War, notice it's from Thucydides' account of the Peloponnesian War. Thucydides was an Athenian general who fought in the war. The way the war got started actually relates to this reading. Thucydides, in the context of the whole book, which I certainly didn't give you to read the whole thing, uses the moral theory of tragedy to explain the war. You see, what happened was that the Greek city-states had built up a common treasury after the Persian Wars in case the Persians came back. And Athens actually confiscated that treasury and spent it on themselves. That's how they paid for the Parthenon. Well, if you belong to a fraternity, sorority, or other club on campus, how would you like it if the treasurer of that organization took the dues that you and other members had been paying in and the money you had earned in fundraisers and stuff and spent that on a new sound system for their car? Well, that's exactly how the other Greek city-states felt about Athens spending their treasury on themselves. And that's what led to this war. This is the war that's in the background to Lysistrata, which we read earlier, in which the women organize a sex strike because they're tired of having the men all away fighting the war. My mom graduated from high school in 1943 or 44. I forget right now which. She told me that once you graduated from high school, at that point, there were no dates, because all the guys were away in the service. In fact, there was a popular song of the time written from a guy's perspective: "Don't sit under the apple tree with anyone else but me." There's a less well-known, but I think funnier song written from the women's perspective. It said, "I can't sit under the apple tree with anyone else but me. What's good is in the army. What's left will never harm me. They're either too young or too old." Because the only guys who were still around were 15, 16-year-old and younger, and 50 plus. Everybody in between was gone. And it was that way in the Peloponnesian War. And in the context of the whole book, this funeral speech is an example of Athenian hubris, excessive, stubborn pride. Think about how glowing a picture he paints of Athens, how they are an example to the rest of the world of freedom and democracy, about how Athens is so wonderful, class considerations never interfere with merit, and poverty doesn't bar the way if a man has ability. He's preferred in public service. You really think money meant that little? Or do you suppose that people who were financially better off had an advantage? He even says that Athens' enemies have no occasion to be upset about being defeated by so great an opponent. Have you ever heard of a country being glad they lost a war? And Thucydides goes on to say that he thinks that any nation that sets out to be great, as Athens did, will inevitably fall into the same trap. And trap it was, because they wound up losing the Peloponnesian War. And that, in fact, plays into why Socrates wound up on trial. See, when things were going well, they were willing to tolerate Socrates asking troublesome questions. But in the aftermath of losing that war, Socrates became a scapegoat. people want to blame somebody else for their defeat. That's how Hitler was elected to power in Germany. Basically by promising to make Germany great again. And he inspired because he told the Germans what they wanted to hear, that their suffering, and as bad as the Great Depression was in America, it was even worse in Germany. A basket full of money wouldn't buy a loaf of bread. He told them that they had not been defeated, but that they had been stabbed in the back by the Jews and the communists. And they wanted to blame somebody other than themselves for their problems. And if that sounds frighteningly familiar to any of you, if it sounds like, the 2016 or 2020 presidential elections, yeah. That's why I voted for Hillary in 2016 and will vote for Biden in 2020. Rump scares me. But Thucydides says any nation that sets out to be great will fall into this same trap of hubris that leads them to ate, to excessive force, to doing something that anybody ought to know better than to do because they get this big head. And Athens did that in confiscating the treasury. They did that in essentially forcing other Greek city-states to either become their allies or wind up being their enemies. One city-state that refused to join them, the Athenians went in and slaughtered everybody, men, women, and children. And so they brought about their own destruction, Thucydides says. Now, as you were reading that speech, I hope that the image of Athens reminded you of another country's self-image a little closer to home. I may have pointed out at the time, if I didn't, I'll do it now, that similarity is no accident. At the time that America was being established in the late 1700s, it's called the neoclassical era. Western culture was consciously looking back to Greece and Rome for models. And so this funeral speech by Pericles was read as a model of what it means to be civilized. And so what does America do? It takes over that Athenian self-image and applies it to itself. You can still get elected giving this speech. Just change Athens to America and Hellas to the rest of the world. And it sounds like an American campaign speech. That ought to give us pause. You know, the rest of the world doesn't always see us the way we see ourselves. They often see us as imperialists. As trampling their rights, their culture. And Thucydides says that any country that sets out to be great will inevitably develop this same hubris that leads them to self-destruction. Well, as that change is happening to Greek culture, along comes a young Macedonian Greek prince named Alexander, who by his conquests spreads Hellenistic Greek culture throughout the Mediterranean world and the Near East, from what is today Serbia, south to Egypt and Libya, and as far east as what is today Afghanistan and Pakistan. And so I want you to remember the dates of his life: 356 to 323 BC. Alexander the Great, we call him. History calls you great if you conquer an empire. And throughout that empire, Alexander deliberately built Greek-style cities, many of them named Alexandria after him. In those cities, schools teaching Greek philosophy grow up. Greek-style theaters are built in which Greek plays are staged. He deliberately spreads Greek culture. Statues made as far east as India in the centuries after Alexander show Greek influence in their style. And in fact, Alexander is responsible for the fact that Greek became the international language of scholarship and business. Although he would never have envisioned this, he's the reason why when early Christians came to write the New Testament, it was written in Greek, because it's the result of Alexander's conquests that everybody who was educated could read and write Greek. In fact, as recently as my grandmother's generation, born in the 1890s, to graduate from high school, you would learn Greek or Latin, if not both. You know, the most useful single language to have worldwide today is English. Ironically, if you travel throughout India, the most useful single language to have is not one of the Indian languages, because they're all spoken only in particular regions. The most useful single language to speak in India today is English, and the reason is because for several hundred years, India was under British rule. In fact, the reason English is the dominant language in the world today is because for the last 300 years, the two dominant superpowers from the West have spoken English. From the 1750s to about 1943, the dominant power was Britain. In fact, they boasted the sun never sets on the British Empire because they had colonies all the way around the world. Of course, the French responded by saying that that's because God doesn't trust an Englishman in the dark. And in 1943, they were replaced as the dominant superpower by us. And if you think there's not an American empire, think again. It is now our influence that makes English the most important language. In the summer of 2019, my wife and I flew to France, met our oldest daughter there. She was coming, at the time she was teaching in Qatar on the Persian Gulf. And we toured mostly France, but also a little bit of Germany. And we were able to get by with English, because at least in the hospitality industry, everybody can speak some English. Amy, my daughter, knew a little bit of French. When we went to Germany, I could handle a little bit of German. But everybody knows some English, and the reason is because the world has been dominated by English-speaking powers for 300 years. Well, Alexander did the same thing for Greek language and Greek culture, just like anywhere you go. Um, I remember in Aachen, Germany, uh, my wife and daughter were doing a little shopping, and I was tired and I wanted to rest a little bit. So I was sitting in a chair at a sidewalk cafe, and when the waiter came to check on me, I, in my best German, haben Sie Coca-Cola? Do you have Coca-Cola? And he said, natürlich, naturally. You know, that's an American drink, right? But there are McDonald's all over the world. We saw some in Europe. Um, you know, we've spread our culture just the same way that Alexander spread Greek culture. In this lesson, we'll be looking at Hellenistic literature with Medea. In the next lesson, we'll look at Hellenistic art and also Hellenistic philosophy with Epicurus and Epictetus. And look for this kind of gloomy, negative outlook and the preoccupation with pain and suffering that's characteristic of the Hellenistic era.